Hello and welcome back. All right, let's go ahead and begin editing Echo. So again, I would work from the top down, and then I would go back and adjust any other of the options as needed once I've set all the other sliders. So again, I'm going to start with the histogram. I know that this image is underexposed and I don't have a lot of detail in the highlights. So if we take our exposure slider and move it to the right, it will make that image brighter. To the left, it will make it darker. So we need to increase the exposure so that we can make it brighter. But how far do we go? Well, obviously that's too far. It doesn't look that good, but we can also see in the histogram that the image is now over edited and overexposed based on these peaks going beyond the top of the histogram. So we want to come back and make sure that we're not clipping any data and that we are filling in this gap on the right. Now at this point, it's going to be dependent on personal taste on how far you fill in that gap. Technically, you could fill in the gap all the way to the right, but I find it to be too bright in the highlights, especially in the green channel. It's almost clipping at the top here. The other thing we can do, and this is another tool that can help us determine if we are over editing, and that's by holding down our Alt or Option key and then adjust the slider accordingly. Your image is going to turn black, but once I go too far, you then see these little color pixels over here, and that's letting you know that the pixels in that area has now been clipped. The detail in the area is gone. So you've over edited. But again, we can see that in the histogram as well. So if you don't want to have that histogram on, you could use this, but even then, visually we can see that it's not very good. And personally, I prefer to have the histogram on. So that's just another little quick tip to help you determine if you're over editing your image. So I'm going to bring this down to around +1. Even though I didn't fill in the gap entirely, I do have my white point, which is part of the highlights as well, which I can increase to add more brightness to the highlights. But I also want to adjust my shadows to bring back some more detail in this area by making this area brighter. But first, I need to adjust my contrast because I'm working from top down. But personally, I do not like to add my contrast with this method. Instead, I like to use my tone curve, which is available through this icon here, and we're going to add our contrast and talk about the tone curve in the next lesson. So for now, I'm just going to skip the contrast slider and jump into the highlights. So the highlights reside on this side of our histogram, and what it allows us to do is bring back detail in, well, the highlights. So I can bring back detail in this area and other parts of the image that have highlights by adjusting the highlight slider to the left. If I move it to the right, then the image gets brighter and I start to lose some detail. So I'm going to bring this down to around -75. Now, the one thing you may have noticed is the overall image became flatter when I adjusted the highlights to the left. And that's because it's taking those pixels and bringing more detail in, which makes the overall image flatter. And that's why we're going to use our tone curve to adjust the contrast specifically in the highlights and the shadows. So I'm going to show you how to do that in the next lesson. Now, the other thing you may have noticed is the histogram moved to the left. If we move it to the left here, we can see that the peaks and valleys have changed, but the overall gap has not increased that much. So I'm going to do -75 for the highlights. Next, I need to bring back some detail in the shadows. Now check this out. This is really cool. It looks really dark and it looks like it's black in the eyes in this area here. And if I zoom in, it looks almost completely black in some parts. But take a look at your histogram. What is it showing you? What is it telling you? Well, it's not underexposed to the point where there's no detail in the shadows or the black points. And we can see that because the peaks and valleys of the shadows and the black points of our histogram is right in the middle of the histogram. So that's telling me that I have a lot of detail in the shadows that I can bring back, and we can do that with our shadow slider. If I move it to the right, it's going to make those shadows brighter, to the left, darker. So we want to move it to the right because we want to bring back detail in that area of the image. And I'm going to go all the way up to around 65. And overall, that makes the image brighter as well. And again, you can see that the peaks and valleys are moving more to the right. So we're starting to balance the overall exposure of the image by filling in the gap and bringing detail back in the highlights and the shadows. So this is how you properly edit your image, by making adjustments according to the histogram and based on what it's telling you. I'm not just randomly moving my sliders to the left and right to see visually what I like. I'm taking the information given to me from the histogram to make sure that I'm not over editing my image. And all the edits that I do begin with this process. Even if I'm going for a creative, artistic edit, all my images begin right here. I want a clean, classic edit to start with so that I have the highest quality image possible for that particular file that I captured, and then I can use my other tools to be more creative. All right, so we're not quite done yet. We have our white and black points. So these will make our pixels either whiter or darker or blacker. So we can take our pixels and the highlights, because the whites reside on the highlights, and make them brighter or darker. To the left, it will make it darker, and it will make your image flatter, less contrast. To the right, you will begin seeing that your image is already increasing in the contrast of the overall image as you slide the whites to the right. But again, I'm starting to clip my data in the histogram because I went too far. So that's a cue to let you know that you're over editing that part of your image, the white points. Again, we can use our Alt or Option key to also see visually if we're clipping data. And right there, we can see the colored pixels, and we know we've gone too far. So I'm going to bring this down to around plus 21. And then we can do the same thing with the blacks. Hold down your Alt or Option key, and this time it turns white, and any black or dark pixels like that lets you know you've gone too far and you're starting to clip data. So I don't want to clip data. And I'm also taking a look at my histogram to see the results that I'm getting based on how far I slide it. To the left, it's going to make it darker. To the right, brighter. So in this case, I want to add a little bit more darkness to my pixels in that area. I don't want to go too far, so I'm going to go around -10. And again, this is adding a little bit of contrast to the overall image. So now that I have all the sliders set where I want them based on the histogram and what I can see visually, I can either go back and make adjustments as needed to the other pixels, and maybe I want to make the highlights a little bit brighter than where they are currently. And now I'm just looking visually at the image and not so much the histogram, and I will adjust this according to my personal editing style. So I'm going to bring this down to around -50 so that the image is not as flat versus being at -75. So go ahead and make these edit adjustments based on your own personal preference. And then in the next tutorial, we'll go ahead and get started on the tone curve.